There are buildings that feel empty, and then there are buildings that feel like they're listening. In Weston, West Virginia, there's a massive stone asylum that stretches across the land like something that never should have survived into the modern world. Long corridors, heavy doors, patient rooms, wards, treatment areas, windows staring out over the grounds, and silence that doesn't feel still. It feels occupied. The building is known today as the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Later, it was called Weston State Hospital. For more than a century, it held people society did not know how to help. People with mental illness, people with disabilities, people with addiction, people with epilepsy, people with dementia, people who were poor, people who were inconvenient, people who were frightened, and people who were forgotten. It began as a place of care, a sanctuary, a building designed around light, air, space, and order. But over time, the promise broke. A hospital meant to hold a few hundred patients eventually held thousands. And when a place built for healing becomes overcrowded, overwhelmed, and full of pain, the walls remember. Today, people say Trans-Allegheny is one of the most haunted places in America. They report voices in empty rooms, footsteps in empty halls, children laughing where no children should be, doors opening by themselves, names whispered in the dark, shadows that move with purpose, and a feeling that the building is not just haunted, but aware. Tonight, we're going inside an asylum that began as a promise and became a legend, a place where history and haunting are almost impossible to separate. Because some buildings don't just hold stories, some buildings answer back. Let's tune in. Somewhere between fact, folklore, and late night speculation, there are stories that refuse to disappear. Signals hidden in the noise, legends whispered in the dark, and mysteries that somehow feel stranger the deeper you dig. Welcome to Dead Signal Radio, strange stories from the edge of static. I'm Michael, and tonight we're going to Weston, West Virginia to talk about the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. This episode continues our haunted location run, but we're shifting the balance a bit. The facts still matter, the history still matters, the people who live there absolutely still matter. But tonight, we're leading deeper into the paranormal reputation of this place. The voices, the footsteps, the children's spirits, the shadow figures, the Civil War stories, the wards that people claim still feel occupied. And the question that sits underneath all of it, if a building spends more than a century absorbing fear, confusion, pain, hope, neglect, and death, what does it give back? Tonight, we're not treating the patients as the horror. That matters. The horror is not mental illness. The horror is not the people who were sent there. The horror is what isolation, stigma, overcrowding, and institutional failure can do to human beings. And if something still moves through those halls, maybe it's not there to scare us. Maybe it's trying to be heard. Before it became a paranormal landmark, Trans-Allegheny was supposed to be a place of treatment. Construction began in the 1850s before West Virginia was even a state. The Civil War interrupted the work. The region itself changed. Virginia split. West Virginia became a state in 1863. And in 1864, the hospital began receiving patients. The building was designed under what was called the Kirkbride Plan. That design philosophy came from Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, who believed architecture could help support mental health treatment. The building wasn't supposed to feel like a dungeon. It was supposed to be therapeutic. Long wings, fresh air, sunlight, open grounds, a central administrative section, patient wards extending outward. The idea was that the building itself could be part of the cure. And that's why the story is so tragic. Because when people see old asylums today, they often immediately think creepy, haunted, dangerous. But many of these buildings began as reform. They were supposed to be better than jails, better than poorhouses, better than families hiding relatives away because they didn't know what else to do. The original vision was care. But buildings do not exist in theory, they exist in reality. And reality is where Trans-Allegheny changed. The hospital was designed for around 250 patients. By the 1950s, it held more than 2,400. That number matters, because a place designed for care can become something very different when it's packed far beyond its limits. Light and air do not mean much when the wards are overcrowded. A beautiful design does not mean much when staff can't keep up. A sanctuary does not remain a sanctuary just because someone once intended it to be one. And that is the first haunting of Trans-Allegheny. Not a ghost, but a broken promise. Most haunted places have a sound. At Waverly Hills, you imagine the echo of a tunnel. At Eastern State, the silence between cells. At the Crescent Hotel, maybe footsteps in a hallway above you. But Trans-Allegheny has voices. That is one of the most common types of reported activity there. People claim to hear whispers, names, distant conversations, children, footsteps accompanied by voices, and sometimes the voices seem to respond. Sometimes they seem to come from just around a corner, and sometimes people say they hear someone speaking from a room they later find empty. That is what makes Trans-Allegheny feel different. A creak can be dismissed, a cold spot can be explained, a shadow can be a trick of light, but a voice feels personal. A voice suggests someone is present, someone aware, someone trying to cross the distance between where they are and where you are. That is the heart of the asylum's paranormal reputation. Not just something moves there, but that something communicates. And in a place where so many people may have gone unheard in life, that detail lands hard. Because what is more fitting? A building full of forgotten people, now famous for voices no one can find. One of the best known spirits associated with Trans-Allegheny is a young girl often called Lily. Different versions of Lily's story exist, and as with many haunted location legends, the details can vary depending on the source, the tour, and the retelling. Some stories describe her as playful. Some say she interacts with toys. Some say visitors have heard a child's voice. Some say she responds to people who speak kindly to her. And whether every story is true or not, Lily has become one of the emotional centers of the asylum's haunting. Child ghost stories are powerful because they're not just frightening, they're sad. The child's voice in an abandoned asylum is not the same as a growl in the dark. It does not feel like a threat, it feels like a wound. And that's why Lily works so strongly within the Trans-Allegheny legend. She gives the building a face, not a monstrous one, a human one. The idea of a child spirit inside a place like that cuts through the usual ghost hunting excitement. Because suddenly the question is not, did something scary happen? It's, who was she? Why is she still here? Does she know she's alone? Now, skeptically, we have to be careful. A ball moving on a floor can have natural explanations. Old buildings are uneven, people expect activity, stories shape what visitors notice, a child's voice could be misheard, an emotional setting can make ordinary sounds feel meaningful. But belief does not grow only from proof, it grows from experience. And for many visitors, Lily is not just a story. She is the moment Trans-Allegheny stops feeling like a building and starts feeling occupied. The wards are where the asylum becomes harder to talk about plainly, because this is where real people lived. This is where patients slept, waited, cried, recovered, declined, fought, endured, and maybe, if the stories are true, remained. Paranormal reports from the wards often include footsteps, voices, doors moving, knocking, and shadow figures. People describe the feeling of being watched, the feeling of walking into a room and knowing you're not alone, and feeling that something follows them down the hall, the feeling that the air changes. Now, the language is common in haunted places, but Trans-Allegheny, it carries a different charge. Because these were not guest rooms, they were not hotel suites, they were not empty cells but only for punishment. They were living spaces inside an institution. And institutions change the people inside of them. Long term institutional life can strip away identity. Schedules replace choice, rules replace privacy, groups replace individuality. A person becomes a patient, a file, a bed, a diagnosis, a number. That's not just history, that is haunting material. If a place can be haunted by emotion, the wards make sense, because they held every kind of emotion: fear, boredom, anger, confusion, loneliness, hope, relief, desperation, and the strange quiet that comes when people stop expecting to be understood. So when visitors say they hear voices in the wards, I understand why the claim feels powerful, even if I can't prove it. Because if any place would have voices left in it, it would be a place full of people society stopped listening to. Many haunted locations have a place people talk about in a lower voice. At Trans-Allegheny, different investigators and visitors point to different hotspots, but the upper floors often carry a reputation for heavier activity. The fourth floor, in particular, is often discussed in connection with more intense experiences. People report shadow figures, footsteps, doors moving, unexplained sounds, a feeling of pressure, a feeling of being followed. a feeling that something in the hall does not want visitors there. Now, whether those plans are paranormal or not, the setting itself is doing serious work. Upper floors and massive old buildings can feel cut off from the world. The farther you move from the entrance, the more the building seems to close around you. The outside gets quieter, the hallway feels longer, the rooms feel more isolated. And in a place like Trans-Allegheny, your mind already knows the story. It knows patients live there, it knows people suffer there, it knows the building is famous for hauntings. So when a door shifts, or a sound carries, or a shadow moves to the edge of a flashlight beam, your brain doesn't file it under normal building noise. It files it under possible encounter. That is the skeptic's explanation. And it's reasonable. But it's also true that many people who visit Trans-Allegheny come away saying the same thing. Something about the building feels active. Not just creepy, active. Like there's a difference between being in an abandoned space and being in a watched one. Shadow figures are one of the most common paranormal reports across all locations. The Trans-Allegheny seems built for them. Long corridors, doorways, dim rooms, uneven light, corners that seem darker than they should be, a massive old building filled with places for the eye to make mistakes. And maybe, if believers are right, places for something else to stand. Visitors have reported seeing dark shapes moving through halls or doorways, figures at the end of corridors, something passing from one room to another, something visible for just a second and then gone. Skeptical explanation is easy enough. Low light, expectation, peripheral vision, shadows cast by other visitors, flashlights, reflections. The brain looking for human shapes because that's what the brain does. That doesn't fully remove the chill. Because the scariest part of a shadow figure is not always seeing it, it's the second after. The moment when your brain asks, did I really see that? Was someone there? Should I say something? Should I keep walking? Should I leave? That moment is where hauntings live. Not always in proof, sometimes in hesitation. And Trans-Allegheny seems to create a lot of hesitation. Trans-Allegheny's history is not only medical. Because construction began before the Civil War and continued throughout the era, the building's story is tied to one of the most unstable periods in American history. The war interrupted construction. The region changed hands politically and culturally. West Virginia itself was born during the war. Stories connected with soldiers, raids, money, and conflict have become part of the broader lore of the site. This gives Trans-Allegheny another layer of haunting. Because the building is not just associated with mental health history, it's associated with war era uncertainty. And that matters because haunted places often become more powerful when multiple histories overlap. One tragedy can haunt a place, but many layers of history can make a place feel saturated. Civil War turmoil, institutional life, medical treatment, overcrowding, death, abandonment, paranormal tourism, all of it sits on top of itself. That's why Trans-Allegheny doesn't feel like it has one ghost story. It feels like a building full of frequencies, different eras broadcasting through the same zone. And when visitors say they hear something there, maybe that's part of why the story works. The building has too many pasts, and maybe not all of them stay quiet. Now, here's the part of the history that makes the hauntings feel heavier. Trans-Allegheny was designed for around 250 patients. By the 1950s, it housed more than 2,400. That's not just overcrowding. That is a system breaking under its own weight. Imagine a place designed around calm and order becoming packed with nearly 10 times the number of people it was meant to hold. Imagine the noise, the stress, the lack of privacy, the overwhelmed staff, the patients with different needs placed into the same strained environment. Imagine trying to heal in a place where there's not enough room to breathe. This is where Trans-Allegheny's ghost stories become more than spooky reports. Because if people hear footsteps in the halls, maybe part of what makes that frightening is knowing how many footsteps once filled them. If people hear voices, maybe the building's history makes every voice feel possible. If someone feels watched, maybe it's because the place once held thousands of lives stacked together inside a system that could no longer truly see them. That's the real pressure inside the asylum. Too many people, too little care, too much history, too many stories, and maybe too many things left unresolved. One of the most interesting categories of paranormal reports is interaction. Not just seeing something, not just hearing something, but feeling like something responds. A knock after a question, a door moving after someone speaks, a sound from an empty room, a name heard after someone asks, "Is anyone here?" This kind of report is common in paranormal investigations at places like Trans-Allegheny, and it's exactly the kind of thing that turns skeptics cautious and believers excited. Because random noise is one thing, timing is another. If you ask a question in an empty ward and something knocks twice, your body reacts before your brain has time to debate acoustics. Now, skeptically, timing can fool us. Old buildings make noises constantly. If you ask enough questions and wait long enough, some sound will eventually happen after a question. That doesn't mean the building answered, but emotionally, it feels like an answer. And that is why Trans-Allegheny's paranormal reputation is so strong. People don't just say the building is spooky. They say it responds. They say it gives names, it makes sounds, it moves, it follows, it interacts. That is much more powerful claim than simply saying, "I felt weird." A building that feels weird is atmospheric. A building that answers back is a legend. Now, we need to talk about the name Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. That is the historical name people know. It's the name used in the site's identity and tourism. But the word lunatic is not a neutral word. It carries stigma. It carries the cruelty of another era. And when we talk about this place, we have to be careful not to drag that cruelty forward. The people who lived inside Trans-Allegheny were not monsters. They weren't horror props. They weren't entertainment. They were human beings. Some were mentally ill. Some were disabled. Some were traumatized. Some were elderly. Some had conditions that were misunderstood. Some may have never belonged there at all. So, yes, we can talk about the hauntings. We can talk about the voices, shadows, and doors. We can lean into the paranormal side. But we're not going to treat the patients as the scary part. The scary part is what can happen when vulnerable people are hidden away. The scary part is what happens when care becomes crowd control. The scary part is the possibility that people who were unheard in life may still be trying to speak of death. That's the line. We can be spooky without being cruel. And with Trans-Allegheny, that line matters. Now, let's take the skeptical pass. Is Trans-Allegheny haunted? We can't prove that. A lot of what people report can have ordinary explanations. Old buildings make noise. Large old buildings make a lot of noise. Wind moves through broken spaces. Floors shift. Doors settle. Animals get inside. Voices carry from other parts of the building. Tour groups influence each other. A guide tells the room exactly, and suddenly every sound in that room feels meaningful. That doesn't make people dishonest. It makes them human. Fear shapes perception. Expectation shapes perception. History shapes perception. And Trans-Allegheny has one of the strongest atmospheres you could ask for. So yes, it's easy to be fooled there. Maybe easier than almost anywhere. But that doesn't mean every experience is false. It just means we should be careful. The best approach is not to say everything's a ghost, and it's not to say everyone's imagining it. The best approach is to say this place affects people. Some reports may have natural causes, some are harder to explain, and the history gives all of it weight. That's where I land. Skeptical, but listening. Now, let's lean fully into the question. What if the place is really haunted? What if some part of Trans-Allegheny did not empty when the doors closed in 1994? What if the voices people hear are not just echoes, wind, or suggestion? What if Lily isn't just a legend? What if the footsteps in the wards belong to people still moving through routines that ended decades ago? What if the shadow at the end of the hallway knows you saw it? What if the building answers because something inside it still wants to be acknowledged? That's the power of Trans-Allegheny. It doesn't need one perfect piece of evidence. It has accumulation. Report after report, voice after voice, story after story. A name heard in the dark, a ball moving in a room, a door shifting, a hallway that suddenly feels crowded, a figure where no one should be. And all of it inside a building where the living were once crowded, isolated, categorized, treated, neglected, and sometimes forgotten. If hauntings are made of unfinished emotion, Trans-Allegheny makes sense. If hauntings are made of trauma, it makes sense. If hauntings are made of people trying to be heard after no one listened, that makes sense. And maybe that's why the building feels so active. Not because it's evil, not because the patients are frightening, because the place is full of unfinished human noise, a dead signal still trying to get through. Trans-Allegheny works as a haunting because it gives us several fears at once. Fear of being locked away, fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing control, fear of being forgotten, fear of institutions, fear of old medicine, fear of long corridors, fear of voices in empty rooms, fear of being watched by something you can't see. But it also gives us sadness, and that sadness is what separates it from cheap horror. A monster jumps out and scares you for a second. A place like Trans-Allegheny stays with you. Because the question is not just, are there ghosts? The question is, what happened here that made people feel like ghosts belong here? That's a strong question, and a harder one. So what do I think? I think Trans-Allegheny is haunted, but I want to be precise about what I mean. Can I prove spirits roam the wards? No. Can I prove Lily moves toys or speaks to visitors? No. Can I prove every shadow is something paranormal? No. But do I think this building is haunted by history? Absolutely. Do I think people feel something real when they walk those halls? Yes. Do I think some reports are genuinely difficult to explain? Absolutely. And do I understand why so many people believe the place is active? Completely. Because Trans-Allegheny is not just an empty asylum, it's a building full of voices. Some historical, some emotional, some maybe paranormal, and all of them are asking to be heard. That is what makes this place so powerful. Not just that people say ghosts are there, but the ghost stories point back to something real. People lived there, people suffered there, people worked there, people died there, and people were forgotten there. And now visitors walk through the halls hoping to hear a whisper. Maybe that's morbid, maybe that's human, maybe it's both. But if the building does answer back, I hope people listen with respect. Because whatever haunts Trans-Allegheny, whether it's spirits, memory, trauma, or the building itself, it deserves more than cheap fear. It deserves to be heard clearly. After all, for more than a century, this was a place full of people society struggled to understand. Maybe the haunting isn't that they're still there. Maybe the haunting is that we finally listening. That's all for tonight. Thanks for spending a little time with me here at Dead Signal Radio. If you enjoyed tonight's mystery, follow along for more strange stories, legends, haunted places, and late night rabbit holes. Until next time, stay curious. And if you hear static, maybe listen a little closer.